Before my wife and I got married, I lived in an incredible apartment near Hollywood with some friends. And it had high ceilings, a fireplace, a giant balcony with a view to the observatory. Now, the downside, beyond cost and commute, was that I shared a wall with our neighbors, or more specifically with their television. To make matters worse, they were night owls who seemed only to watch movies with repeated explosions. Now, surprisingly, that experience shed some light on one of the biggest issues going on in 1 Corinthians. Not the explosion part, but noisy neighbors. I know I've been doing a devotional on the book of Acts, but I can't help but be fascinated by the way that Acts informs our reading of Paul's letters, and vice versa, how reading Paul's letters can inform the way that we read Acts. A few weeks ago in Acts, I read the line, "Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God," which I shared meant that the first Christian church, the first Christian house church in Corinth was right next door to the synagogue. Now, Titius was apparently wealthy enough to host the entire church of Corinth for worship, at least at the start. The scholar Craig Keener offers a helpful comment. He says, Romans built their well-to-do urban homes with large vestibules opening onto the street so that clients could gather there in the mornings. Now, this cultural and architectural characteristic of wealthy Roman households provided a natural setting for one of the most ample forms of house churches. It reminds me of our parking lot worship services through much of the pandemic. Like, all that we did was open to our neighbors. If we've got conflict, strife, or disorder in worship, if no one shows up or it's a packed house, it's right there for the world to see. Hold on to that for a moment. When many of us think of Corinthians, what do we think of? Chapter 13, maybe? If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong, right? It's speaking of tongues. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul says this, "Thus tongues are a sign not for believers, but for unbelievers. While prophecy is a sign not for unbelievers, but for believers. If therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues, and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say, 'You are out of your minds'?" Why does Paul ask that? Because it was happening. The church was gathered on these open-air porches or vestibules, and everybody is speaking in tongues, interrupting and speaking over one another. No one there to interpret, just straight charismatic utterance. And you've got Jews sitting in the synagogue next door trying to listen or pray. Or unbelievers walking by thinking, what in the world is going on here? Not the witness you want. It shouldn't surprise us that Paul goes on to remind them, for God is not the God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people. In other words, the church's ordered worship is itself missional. In our day, there are debates about the role that tongues play. Have they ceased or are they still active? You can't use this passage to make your case either way. Paul doesn't seem to be relegating the role of tongues as somehow invalid. His contention is that based on their contribution to the church's witness, they may be personally edifying, but they're not building up the body. When given free rein, they're disorderly, they're distracting, and they deter people from the gospel. Now, you may be wondering, what does this have to do with us today? We're not in a season where we're worshiping outside, and I don't think we're in danger of a bunch of people interrupting our services speaking in tongues. The challenge is to evaluate the way that we live out our faith as individuals and corporately and ask, are there things that we are doing that aren't wrong in and of themselves, but are still impacting our witness to the world around us, such that they are getting in the way of us sharing the gospel? That's food for thought. Have a blessed week.